No problem.
This is great.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. It's time to get started here, I believe. As always, if you'd be so kind as to turn off your cell phones. You guys are better than Kicklighters class. There's not a lot of fumbling for things, you know. But anyway, today will be the last class of this series, and indeed, I refer to this as Collapse, the End of World War II, and the Rise of the New Asia. So hopefully we can get through this whole thing today. There's quite a lot to cover. Well, first, we'd like to talk about something I intentionally put off last week, was talking about Indonesia and the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And quite honestly, if you look at the map, you can see that the pinky color is going to be the Japanese Empire, approximately 1942, and the dark red color is where the Dutch East Indies are. And so indeed, this is what we're going to talk about to start this class today. So as we spoke about, indeed, they had this idea of a Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. There was going to, of course, be exploitation of these people until the war was won, but also the goal was to create Pan-Asianism and to get rid of Western imperialism. So that's the big picture for the Japanese. Well, so indeed, what we know today is Indonesia was controlled by the Dutch from 1603 until 1942. And then in 3.5 years, the Japanese had taken that over. And then the Dutch tried to regain their colony in 1945, which was not particularly successful. And indeed, Indonesia becomes a new country, a free country in 1949. So Dutch rule was pretty harsh. The Dutch did everything they could really in that time frame to make sure that the Indonesian people were not, able to unify. Let's put it that way. So unlike the U.S. and the Philippines, we made an effort to teach the Philippine people English. The Dutch do not do that because, quite honestly, they don't want to try to unify this country. There's a lot of separate languages. Indonesia is, I don't even know, there's over 1,000 islands that make up the country. And there's a lot of different languages, much like the Philippines. But they don't want to educate these people in that regard. And that is simply so that they don't have to worry about a unification down the road. So it's a different kind of idea of how they're going to manage these colonies. Well, another thing I found out actually building this class is the economy of colonies is significantly different than what I really thought. I always thought, that the colonies were just kind of like a normal economy. Well, they're not. Their economy is built basically to supply goods and services to the colonial masters, if we want to put it that way. And particularly in countries like this, it's designed to have extraction. So they don't really build an economy that's self-sufficient. They actually build an economy that's dependent on other goods and services in order to survive, particularly in some cases food. And what happens is the Japanese, well before World War II, are providing the Dutch East Indies with a lot of cheap goods. Well, when the Depression comes along, what happens is that these Dutch begin to put extreme amounts of tariffs on goods to control their markets. And the idea there is that they can, not lose sales in effect. Well, the Indonesian people have become dependent on cheap Japanese goods. And so they are really, really unhappy about this. And indeed, they begin to see Japan as a source of prosperity. So they become, even well before World War II, become closer to the Japanese. Well, the Japanese land on the main island of Java. They land on that island on March 1st of 1945. And much like we've seen in Burma and we've seen in Malaya, the Japanese people, the Japanese army is welcomed by the Indonesian people as basically liberators. The Japanese have, again, like they did in these other places, have made a conscious effort to support Indonesian independence groups. So in fact, there's this fifth column in Indonesia, and also the Indonesian people basically turn on the Dutch. They don't really like the Dutch at all. So again, we see the Japanese being welcome. Well, that's going to be temporary, of course, but another key thing is that the Dutch nationals there and many other white nationals that are in this area decide not to leave. Now, they had a few months. They could have basically begin to evacuate from this area in the face of Japanese aggression, but they decide not to do that. And I believe part of the reason for that is simply that they felt that they had looked at French Indochina, and the French Indochina, the Japanese left, of course, they were under the Vichy government, left them in control of much of the administration of this area. The Dutch felt that indeed they would have to be in charge of the administration because the Indonesians never had been. Well, unfortunately for them, that's not how it's going to work out. So what the Japanese are going to do when they get into Java particularly is they are going to intern approximately 200,000 Dutch and white people into internment camps. They will have a very harsh time there, and approximately 30,000 of those will perish in internment under Japanese rule. But what this also does is the Japanese put Indonesians into these administrative posts. So this begins to train Indonesians to basically manage their own country. Of course, they're under Japanese control. But indeed, they're put in these administrative roles that they've never been in before. So I think that's significant as we talk about this too. And of course, I'd mentioned that the Japanese are going to have to treat this in an exploitive manner until the war is won. At that point, they will theoretically create what they call the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. I'm not quite sure that it would have worked out quite that well because of the Japanese thinking that they're racially superior people, but indeed that was the thought process. So indeed there were going to be this period of extraction, be basically colonial rule under the Japanese, and then post-war that would end, and there would be this group of Asian nations and be granted independence, for example. Well, part of that exploitation part is called Ramusha. And the Ramusha are basically unpaid laborers that are conscripted to aid the Japanese. And I'm sure many of you have seen the movie Bridge on the River Kwai. And you saw in that they were building a railroad in Burma, and it was being built by British POWs. Well, indeed, many of these Indonesian Ramusha were building that railroad as well. And their conditions were terrible, just as bad as the POWs. The Japanese treated these people horribly. One of the classic examples is building a railroad in Sumatra. And the railroad in Sumatra, the belief is that approximately 20,000 of these Ramusha died building that railroad. So they were not just to work in Indonesia, they were basically shipping these people all over Southeast Asia and basically slave laborers of the Japanese. Well, for the Japanese themselves, though, life in Indonesia was outstanding. They referred to being stationed on Java as heaven. They were living the good life there. They weren't fighting. They had plenty to eat. Indeed, they coerced many of the Indonesian women to become what was known as comfort women. In other words, to serve in brothels for the Japanese army. And they view the Indonesians themselves as basically being lazy, and they see themselves as vastly superior to Indonesians. So they're not really generating a lot of goodwill in Indonesia at this time, to put it honestly. And much like we've talked about in the Philippines, the Indonesian people are beginning to really hate the Japanese. And some of this is because of cultural issues. So it's completely normal for a Japanese officer to slap a Japanese subordinate. It's completely normal, basically, to hit them with a stick. Well, it's completely unnormal to do this kind of behavior in Indonesia. Just to touch somebody's head, even if you're their superior, is definitely bad behavior. It's an affront. It's something that they don't tolerate. So when they go around slapping Indonesian people, and the Philippines as well, these people really don't like that. They're angered by this behavior by the Japanese because no one even touches your head in Indonesia. And another key piece is there's a significant Muslim population in this area. And they are demanding that the Indonesian people turn towards Japan and bow to the emperor. Well, indeed, Muslims only think that they should turn to Mecca and pray. So this again causes huge amounts of issues between these two groups. So we see that the Japanese behavior in these islands is not particularly good. Well, we need to talk a little bit about this gentleman, and I intentionally did not talk about him last week, and this is Sukarno. You may remember that Sukarno was head of Indonesia until the early 1960s. And he is been a key person in Indonesian independence movements. He's been arrested by the Dutch. He is arrested again, and this time he is exiled to a small island off of Sumatra. And so while he's there, he really starts to get involved with this Pan-Asianism movement. And then the Japanese come in and they take him and put him back on Java. The idea is that he's going to help control the Indonesian people. He's going to help ease the way for the Japanese occupation. Well, he gets really into this Pan-Asian movement. He says this: independent Indonesia can only be achieved with Dai Nippon. Dai Nippon is Japan. For the first time in all my life, I saw myself in the mirror of Asia. So as we talked about last week, he's really getting into this Pan-Asian movement. And I also said he wasn't invited to that Greater East Asian Conference. Now, remember that Greater East Asian Conference, they grant independence to India, even though it's only two little islands. They grant independence to Burma. They grant independence to the Philippines. They do not grant independence or even invite him to this conference. The reason is simply this, because we talked from Kenryo Sato says this, that Tojo doesn't want them to be free at this point because they're not quite ready to handle all that treasure. Okay, we kind of need to control this area for a while, okay, because this is really the heart of the southern resource area. There's oil, there's rubber, there's all these things that the Japanese need for their war effort. Well, Sukarno makes the decision that he's going to cooperate with the Japanese because he feels that that's the way to gain independence for Indonesia. And he's going to become basically a collaborator, and he's going to sacrifice literally millions of Indonesian lives in order to accomplish this goal. So he actively supports the Ramusha. He helps to recruit about 1 million Indonesians to serve as slaves for the Japanese war effort. Huge issue. The Japanese at this time also begin to adopt really strict agrarian policies. It's terrible, really. What they're going to do is, if I grow rice on Java, I am required to sell my rice to the Japanese people. They are not going to pay me a fair price for this rice. Also, they're going to requisition 60% of what I grow. So now basically, I have no money coming in to speak of, and I'm also don't have enough food to feed my family. They're also going to begin to stop production of food and begin to make the Indonesians grow castor oil plants. And the idea of that is they're going to be able to use that as a lubricant for the Japanese war effort. So the result of this is going to be mass starvation in Indonesia. In 1944 to 1945 on the island of Java, approximately 1 million Indonesians are going to starve to death. Over the entire Japanese occupation of this area, they lose about 4 million people. But Sukarno views these sacrifices that they are necessary to achieve independence of Indonesia in the future. Well, naturally, the Allies during World War II view Sukarno as a collaborator, and indeed, he is a collaborator. Well, there's another key piece to Indonesia too that I really want to talk about, and that's the creation of a separate Indonesian force that's going to be created by the Japanese, assisted, let's put it that way. And simply it's this: the Japanese want to recruit in 1943 Indonesians directly into the Japanese army. We've seen a similar thing that goes on with Okinawa. They wanted to basically have Okinawans join, which they did, join the Japanese army and fight the U.S. on that battle. They want to do the same thing in Indonesia. The Indonesians, even people that are heavily in favor of Japanese control and see Japan as a way to free themselves, they say, well, I don't think that's really what we want to do. It might be a better idea to create a separate Indonesian force. And that Indonesian force is going to be called in English the Volunteer Army of Homeland Defenders. If you translate that to Bahasa Indonesia, it would have the letters PETA. So we'll just refer to it as PETA, because quite honestly, my pronunciation of Indonesian is not particularly good. So basically, they got a huge turnout. The Indonesian youth are there. This is great. We're going to learn how to fight the Dutch. We're going to learn how to fight the Allies, and they get a huge turnout. And the Japanese are very satisfied with this. They're pleased. This is going well. This is going to grow to a force of about 35,000 Indonesians that are trained to fight. And you can see here the picture: little Indonesian boys with wooden guns being trained by the Japanese in order to become part of PETA. And so they're going to create this new Indonesian independent army. Not particularly big, but still, it's something they've got. And so PETA's role is really to put out that it's to protect the homeland, particularly from the Dutch, particularly from the Allies, not about the Japanese. Now, there are several PETA revolts late in the war against the Japanese, but I would say these are relatively insignificant. So what happens, of course, is now we've got a trained military in Indonesia. And indeed, the people that are going to lead the fight against the Dutch when they return are going to be people that were part of PETA, particularly Suharto. By the way, when Sukarno was deposed in the 60s, Suharto will become in charge of the Indonesian government at that time. It will be a military government. Well, when we look at Indonesia, there's three key pieces here as far as how this will lead to independence for Indonesia post-war. And quite honestly, it's the Japanese have put them in a position of administrative responsibility. They've helped them learn those positions. The Japanese have created a military force to fight the Dutch. When the Dutch try to return in 1945, they are going to be opposed by people that are trained to fight. And also the Japanese have created this idea of Asia for Asians. They've demonstrated the ability for the Asians to basically become free of Western imperialism and actually Japanese imperialism as well. So three pieces here that I thought were very critical for this course for the future of Asia can be demonstrated with their occupation of Indonesia. Well, let us move on to something I refer to as three battles that changed the world in 1944. And these battles, I think, were critical to our world today. And the first I'll talk about is D-Day, which, with landing on the European continent by the United States, Britain, Canada, etc., we managed to get ourselves very directly involved with defeating Nazi Germany, which we all feel good about today. I know I feel good about D-Day. We all basically, it's become part of American ethos that indeed this was the fight against Nazis, against the fascists, and helped free the world. We feel good about that. It also has another effect in the fact that we can reimpose democratic governments in Western Europe. Now let's talk about Bagration. Bagration is a giant Soviet offensive that took place right after D-Day, a couple of weeks, I believe. And this is a tremendously large and important Russian offensive. It is perhaps, well, I'd say definitely in World War II, this is the biggest defeat that Germany will have. It may be the biggest defeat the German arms have had in history. So Bagration manages to destroy the entire German army group center. I didn't say army, I said army group. So that the casualties here for the Germans are going to be actually much larger than Stalingrad. Huge, huge defeat. And at this point, with Bagration going on, there is absolutely no way, in my opinion, that Germany could win this war. So after Bagration, Germany is realistically defeated. They don't have an operation. Now, what's that going to do? That's going to create the Russians, the Soviets advancing into Eastern Europe and creating Soviet-style governments. And well, of course, this will lead to is that in the Western side, we would create NATO. In the East, under Soviet rule, they will make the Warsaw Pact. And of course, that will be the confrontation that we all grew up in, is called the Cold War. Well, Bagration and D-Day caused that. And certainly that doesn't end realistically until 1989. Some might say, future historians might look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and say, well, and the confrontation with NATO we live in today, and say, well, probably it didn't end in 1989. But I'm going to leave that to future historians. That's not my job here today. But the other one that's really important that changes the world that we live in is an offensive called Ichi-Go. Now, Ichi-Go can be translated as Operation Number 1, or it can be translated as Final Operation. And the idea of Ichi-Go is there's going to be a huge offensive in China to knock China out of the war. And this is going to take place in 1944. Well, we talked about this previously, that indeed in 43 and 44, the Japanese are not convinced that they've lost World War II. They're still, remember, they're trying to rebuild their fleet, their carrier fleet in 43. They will have a major sea battle in 44, which was part of their plan. So the Imperial Japanese Navy is tasked by the Emperor in order to defeat the U.S. Navy. The Imperial Japanese Army is tasked to create a huge victory on the Asian mainland. So up until 44, the Japanese really don't think that the war is over or they're going to lose. They still believe that they can get that negotiated peace that they're always looking for. Well, of course, on the naval side, in June of 44, we have the Battle of the Philippine Sea, or we like to call it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. And indeed, that is a huge failure. But the land forces, a little bit, somewhat different outcome, really. So they get this guy, and his name is Field Marshal Hatta. He is in charge of the Japanese army in China. And he is going to try to devise a plan to knock China out of the war. And it's going to be the largest Japanese offensive in World War II. And that's all the way in 1944. Well, we've got three goals. First goal, of course, is to capture territory. And they're going to capture that territory. And what they want to do is they want to create a land route from French Indochina all the way up to the Beijing area and then up towards Korea. And that will allow them to use a rail line to bring in materials from the southern resource area. Big goal. A lot of territory. But that's what they want to do. Why do they want to do that? Because our submarines are sinking so many of their cargo ships. So they need to find a land route in order to resupply, because they're not getting stuff back at enough tonnage in order to maintain their war economy. First piece. Second piece, there's going to be a lot of U.S. air bases that are in China. Some of them are actually relatively close to the coast. So these, under Claire Chennault, are actually beginning to interdict the sea lanes. They definitely want to get rid of those air bases. They also realize that the B-29 is coming on board. And so they want to make sure that they can move the Chinese far enough away, or knock them out of the war, even better, so that indeed the B-29 will not be used in China to bomb the Japanese cities. And of course, like I said, the most important single thing is to knock China out of the war. They've been trying to knock China out of this war since 1937. So it needs to be over so they can redeploy their forces to fight the United States. So if they can knock China out of the war, that will free up hundreds of thousands of troops.
You list there, nationalist China.
Yes.
What about Mao Zedong?
We will get there.
Pardon me.
Mao will be a key part of this presentation, trust me. Well, so how's he going to get these forces? He's going to strip that Kwantung army that's in Manchuria, or as they like to refer to it as Manchukuo. And that's that big force that they always keep to prevent the Russians from intervening in their efforts to control China. Even though they've signed a non-aggression pact with the Russians in 1941, neither side trusts the other, and with good reason. And so basically, he's going to strip a large amount of those forces away. The other thing he's going to do is he's going to take forces that are confronting Mao Zedong. He's going to remove some of that force that's confronting Mao Zedong, because Mao Zedong is not having a Western-style battles with Western-style divisions. He's basically conducting a guerrilla war. So they feel that they can contain that with what they have. They can strip some troops away from there, and that is going to give him a force that's large enough to launch this giant offensive. How big is that force? Well, it's going to basically consist of 17 divisions, about 500,000 men, about 15,000 vehicles, 6,000 artillery pieces, 800 tanks, and 100,000 horses. And for the Japanese to deploy 800 tanks, this is a huge amount for them. They never build that many tanks in World War II. So this is a gigantic force. Again, this will be the largest single offensive in Japanese history. Well, what's facing this attack is primarily the nationalists. They are in southern and central China. Remember, Mao controls the northwestern part of China with his guerrilla armies. The key parts of China are controlled indeed by the nationalists. And these armies are in very poor shape. Very poor. They don't have a lot of transport. They certainly don't have a lot of tanks. The men are underfed. Morale is incredibly poor. Remember, these people have been fighting since 1937, but indeed, they have stopped getting any supplies since 1942. So basically, they're basically living off the land. The main ability for China's industry is along the coastline, as it is today. So the only major city that they really control that has industry is Chongqing. Well, that's very difficult for them to support Western-style armies. As we've talked about, their conscription program is terrible. They will march into a village, they will round up the guys and basically take them off and have them be in the army. This is not a good plan to build up a lot of morale. So you've got corruption, you've got mismanagement, you've got lack of supplies. Remember, they're not getting Lend-Lease support of any significant amount because everything has to be flown in. And what's flown in is primarily going to the Army Air Force. And then at this time, a lot of that is going into the buildup to create that B-29 force in China. So the nationalists are in terrible, terrible shape. And there's a giant starvation in the Henan area, in that province. And part of the reason they're having that starvation is because of the nationalists. Remember, the nationalists are living off the land. The nationalist government doesn't have a way to gain income because there's no real productivity anymore from the coastal taxes, etc. So what they begin to do is they begin to use food as a tax. So in other words, to pay your tax, you have to give food to the nationalist government. And that's what they're using to supply these attempt to have Western-style armies. Well, people are starving. They're not really very fired up about donating any food to the nationalists at this point. And this is turning the people, particularly in Henan, against the nationalists. And so much so that they begin to try to the Chinese people try to begin to disarm the nationalist government soldiers. They basically steal food, equipment, and they're not supporting the nationalists at this particular time. So there's a major issue how weak the Chinese are versus this Japanese huge offensive. Well, I've used this picture before, but I just wanted to remind us that the dark area is areas controlled by the Japanese. So you can see in this, there's a gap between the Vietnam, basically, and where the Japanese have their main control of China. The goal of Ichi-Go is to close that gap. And that way they think they're going to, again, have that rail line, they're going to capture those air bases, and indeed, they're going to knock the Chinese nationalist government out of the war. And this is the plan. It's 3 parts. First, we're going to start up in the north. They're going to cut that salient that goes in. They're going to close that area. They're going to continue to march south. They're going to, when they march south, there's going to be a huge fight in the center area. That battle will be hopefully concluded in Japan's favor. Then they will continue to march south. And you see the blue circle, that's where those key air bases that they want to capture that are by the coastline, so they can stop that interdiction of supplies there. And indeed, they also want to push us further away from the big red circle is where Chongqing and the B-29 airfields will be. They want to perhaps push that further away, or at least put it under a check of Japanese air power. And then finally, the goal is to drive further south. There will be a link up from the Hong Kong area and from what's known today as French Indochina at the time. And hopefully they will then make that complete corridor. And that's the Japanese plan in 1944, early 44. Well, the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek are well aware of this. They certainly can see this buildup of Japanese forces occurring in their area, and they're basically going, we need everything we have in order to help stop this Japanese offensive. They can see it coming. And so what he begins to do, Chiang Kai-shek, is he begins to withdraw forces that he has basically containing Mao Zedong. So basically, they're not really fighting the Chinese communists, but they're controlling areas up in the north so that the Chinese communists can't expand. So they're going to withdraw those forces. There's going to be some other issues, too, with the forces that he needs. But just so we understand that indeed there's a benefit there for the Chinese communists. Well, starts on 19th of April, 44. The Japanese launched this major assault. Chang's armies, again, they're in terrible condition, and they're easily defeated. They're basically crushed. And this is a huge shock to the Chinese people. This is a huge shock to the nationalist government, and it's a particularly upsetting thing to the United States of America. Things are going very, very poorly in China. Well, first week of June, they launched the Center Offensive. And once again, they're being very successful. The Chinese have defended the city of Changsha 3 times in this war leading up to 1944. And every time they have been successful defending this city. This time, the Japanese launched a 3-pronged attack, different tactics, and they captured Changsha in 47 days. A huge, huge disaster for the nationalists at this point. Fortunately, the city of Henyang, this is probably the only bright spot in the entire Ichi-Go offensive for the nationalists, Chinese, is that in Henyang, what's going to happen is they put a force of 17,000 guys into this city. And the Japanese will launch an attack which eventually grows to 3 full divisions to try to capture this one little city. And they managed to hold out for about 6 weeks. So it's quite an impressive defensive case. Again, the general in charge of Henyang, the Chinese general, is actually honored by the Emperor of Japan. He's trying to basically coerce him into becoming part of the greater East Asian CoProsperity sphere. He does not get coerced. He actually escapes from Japanese captivity and is then welcomed back in Chongqing as a hero, which he is. So what happens, though, is the Chinese have held them off. It's slowed this offensive at least somewhat. But with the fall of that city, there's absolutely nothing to prevent the Japanese from marching westward and capturing Chongqing. There's no force to stop them. They continue on with their regular plan, which is to continue to move south and make that link up. Now, many historians would think this is a missed opportunity, and I do feel that there is a missed opportunity there in a sense. But I think that more is made of this than really it's worth, as we'll talk about shortly. But again, that is the one bright spot in this entire offensive. Well, the Japanese have also begun to have reprisals against the Chinese people, particularly in the Hainan area, where there's very much the starvation going on, and they begin to burn the crops. So the estimates just in this little time frame is about another 200,000 Chinese civilians will perish in this area against, again, Japanese burning their crops, etc., burning their towns. Well, finally, on November 1st of 1944, they launched their third and final attack. That will, of course, like I showed you, would be some people coming from Hong Kong, some people coming from French Indochina, and indeed, the other ones keep coming south. And what they do, of course, is they're going to make that link up. Big victory for the Japanese in a sense. The Chinese that are opposing this thing, particularly, are people that were in Changsha. They're very, very demoralized. They're out of weapons. They're out of supplies. They do the best they can, but indeed, they are not able to stop this offensive. And so 2 of the 3 major goals of Ichi-Go have been achieved. They've captured the land route that they wanted for the rail line. They have moved those air bases. They haven't quite knocked the Chinese government out. In a lot of ways, they have. They basically, their armies are non-effective at this point. So, in a sense, we can see that they have achieved perhaps somewhat of that goal as well. So many historians would think that this was a huge victory for the Japanese. And in a tactical sense, you'll see that it actually is. Well, there's the first picture. There's the gap. There's Chongqing and the air bases, that red circle. You look to the picture on the right, you can see that the Japanese have now captured all this territory. But it's taking them until basically late January of 1945 to do this. Well, as we've talked about too, by late January of 1945, the United States is knocking on the doorstep of Japan. And so the Japanese are basically in a very difficult position. So they've captured all this area, but the rail line, for example, you can get stuff up to Korea, let's say, but because of our intervention and blockade, they can't get it from Korea to Japan. So there's no gain there for the Japanese. The Japanese have now expanded into a much larger area, but they now need those troops to go back to the Japanese homeland to defend against the United States. So they're in the wrong position. So the real gain of this for the Japanese is certainly not strategic, because they've basically lost the war because of us. But indeed, this was their goal, to win the war by knocking China out of the war, and they've come very close to doing that. But there's a lot of things of why is this so important? Like I said, this is one of the most important battles of that leads to today, and one of that reasons is going to be because of this Stillwell affair. And this is, I think he's aptly named, being named Vinegar Joe Stillwell, actually. But so why is Stillwell in China? Well, first of all, he's served in China several times. He speaks very good Mandarin. He can actually write Chinese. So he's appointed, basically, his list of jobs is, I actually have to read it. He has so many, okay? So he is basically chief of staff to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. So basically, Chiang Kai-shek has an American as part of his chief of staff. He is also commander of the China-Burma-India Theater. He's responsible for all of Lend-Lease, and he's going to be commander of the Southeast, deputy commander of the Southeast Asia Command, which, as I've told you, that's the acronym is SEAC, which the Americans like to refer to as Save England's Asian Colonies. But he's not a kind of person that's going to get along with anybody. He's constantly fighting with Claire Chennault over Lend-Lease. He's fighting with the British, and particularly he's fighting with the Chinese nationalists. Again, he's supposed to be a liaison between the United States government and Chiang Kai-shek, and he hates Chiang Kai-shek. I mean, that's the best way I can put it. He thinks that he's incompetent. He thinks he's corrupt, and he doesn't refer to him as, not to his face, of course, but he refers to Chiang Kai-shek by the name Peanut. This is a particularly poor choice for someone to represent us to another nation state that's considered to be one of the 4 big policemen of the world. This is not, I couldn't think of anything worse than him really having this job. Plus, he's not a very good military commander on top of that, but that's besides the point as far as this goes right now. It's just amazing how much trouble this is going to cause that we still live with today. And so what's going on? And Stillwell is committed to building that Lido Road. And he wants to create a modern China. Yes, sir.
That one that goes zigzag up the hill?
Yes, the Lido Road, it leads from India to Burma, and it zigzags through the mountains, all those lacettes, as they call them in France. It never is effective. Yes, that's true. It's never really effective. But he loves this road. In fact, they've named it after him today. So, anyway, he's committed to this. And he wants to build this road, and he wants to create a modern Chinese field army that fight the Japanese. And Claire Chennault, who's in charge of the Army Air Force in China, says, we don't have the logistics capability to do this. It would be far better to support the Air Force and the nationalists fighting the Japanese than it would be to spend all these forces trying to build this road. And Stillwell goes, no. I need these forces. Okay, I need to build this road, and this is going to be what's going to help us defeat the Japanese on the Chinese mainland. And he'll go so far as to demand troops that Chang desperately needs to stop Ichi-Go. And I talked a little bit about that last week, called that Y force. So he's got Chinese, and he's demanding that Chiang Kai-shek help him invade northern Burma so he can build this road. And Chang is like, no, we can't do this. Okay, I need more supplies. I don't need to be doing this. I need to fight the Japanese in central China. Well, Stillwell goes so far as to accuse Chang of withholding forces that he's using to fight Mao Zedong. Okay, as we talked about, he's actually withdrawn forces, but he accuses him of withholding his best forces to contain Mao and not fighting the Japanese. And the Chinese are like, this is crazy, okay? And again, they need everything he can to resist Ichi-Go, but Stillwell is just demanding, and finally, actually, Chang has to give in and send troops to help liberate northern Burma to create this road, as we've talked about, that's never effective. It brings in 175,000 tons of supplies, which is a drop in the bucket for what the effort was made to build this thing. So I could go on for days about how bad a commander Vinegar Joe is, but just to speed things up, what he does is he lobbies to the U.S. government. It starts with Marshall. He's good friends with Marshall, by the way. Marshall should never have appointed him, by the way, too, but that's another story. And Marshall then goes to FDR. And FDR this is 44. He's in the middle of a campaign to be reelected president, and he's not having a particularly easy time of it. And FDR, the last thing he needs is a disaster in Burma. Okay, so he's like, well, I think I better take the advice of Stillwell, and we better do something about this. So what he decides to do is send an incredibly harsh note to Chang. And basically he tells Chang, you know what I want you to do? You're going to make Stillwell in charge of all Chinese armies, including the communist armies. Well, let's think that through a little bit. That's kind of like if the British told us that we were incompetent in World War II and that Montgomery should take George Marshall's job and they were going to run the United States Army. That's really, really questionable. And it's amazing that you would try to do that to a modern nation state that you're just in 43, it said is going to be one of the 4 policemen of the world. And this is what FDR does. And he sends this note. It's really harsh. And Stillwell says, I'm going to present this note to Chang myself. And FDR sent an envoy. His name is Hurley. He's not the ambassador. The ambassador at this time, he will become the ambassador, but the ambassador at this time is Clarence Gauss. And Hurley tells Stillwell, he goes, no, you're not going to deliver. Don't deliver that yourself. You and Chang don't get along at all. This is going to be terrible. And Stillwell insists that, nope, I'm going to give this note to Chiang Kai-shek. I'm going to stuff it in his face. And that's what he does. So Chang receives this note. He looks at it, manages to contain his anger temporarily, and immediately dismisses the meeting. Well, so after delivering this ultimatum, in effect, to the Chinese, in other words, if they don't appoint Stillwell, they will get no more aid from the United States. Stillwell writes a little poem to his wife. He goes, I've waited long for vengeance. At last I've had my chance. I looked the peanut in the eye and kicked him in the pants. This is a person that's representing us to a nation state. Okay, it's childish. And of course, Chang is going to blame Stillwell for taking troops away that he needed to fight Ichi-Go and for the lack of U.S. support through giving them arms and lend-lease, and that's why the Japanese offensive of Ichi-Go is successful. This is going to have long-lasting issues between the United States and China. Well, again, it's caused this major crisis, and Chang goes to Hurley and says this, that the Chinese people are tired of the insults which Stillwell has seen fit to heap upon them. He then goes to to a national committee meeting of the Chinese government, and he tells his committee meeting that indeed what this is if he accepts to have an American commander in charge of all Chinese armies, that he is in effect just as bad as Wang Jingwei, who we talked about, the traitor that has his alternate government in Nanking, that he would be just as bad, because now the Americans are just as bad an imperialist country as indeed the Japanese are imperialists. So we see what a huge rift this is creating. That indeed he's looking at America as an imperialist power versus by taking the power away from the Chinese government to run their own military. Well, Hurley reports back to Washington and goes, and Hurley's a very odd character. Again, I don't have time to go into great detail about this guy, but the best way I can put it is strange. Look him up. He's kind of funny. So he says back to Washington, that Stillwell's a fine man, but is incapable of understanding and cooperating with Chiang Kai-shek. And he goes on to say that if we keep Stillwell, there's a very good possibility that the Japanese are going to control China. So he makes a strong statement there. Well, Chang has cooled down. He realizes he can't do without U.S. aid. He can't possibly, get himself in this position. And he basically tells FDR that not to be in command of all Chinese armies, but to basically be the chief of staff, that he will accept any other U.S. commander except Stillwell. And indeed, Stillwell is going to be replaced. Quietly. We'll get there too. It's not that quiet. Okay, so he gets replaced, and his replacement is a guy named Wiedemeyer. And Wiedemeyer is not made Chang's chief of staff. He is just in charge of U.S. forces that are stationed in China. So basically what FDR is, he's detached the U.S. government from the Chinese government, because we don't want to even be associated with if there's going to be a major disaster, which they think there's going to be. So indeed, by separating those two, we don't have the responsibility that we would have had if an American commander is there and things go completely south. And so really, again, it's another kind of a political decision. Well, what about the U.S. press? Well, that's another whole story, because we got this guy, Brooks Atkinson. And Brooks is actually a drama critic for the New York Times. And he decides, you know, with the war going on, I think I'd like to be a war correspondent. And the New York Times sends him perhaps to, well, not to perhaps, but they send him to Russia, for example. And he goes and reports about the communists, you know, in Soviet Union, and he's very positive about their fight against the Germans. And then he goes to Mao's capital, which is the town of Yan'an. And he goes to Yan'an and he thinks, this is great. I love Mao. He's super. Okay, he's doing a great job. And you know, and that Chang, on the other hand, he's a problem. You know, he's a fascist, and you know, he's just anything. He's corrupt. You know, he's just a terrible guy. And he, yes.
This is typical of the New York Times, because another one of their reporters was buried at the Kremlin.
Yes, that's another case. For you in Zoom land, the statement is made is that sometimes, frequently, at this time, the New York Times backed a leftist view. I think that's your basic idea.
I'd say directly communist.
Okay, we don't want to go there. Yes.
I was just thinking, I suspect that the reason Chang Kai-shek was incompetent in Stillwell's eyes is because he didn't agree with whatever Stillwell did.
The question was Chiang Kai-shek viewed as incompetent in Stillwell's eyes because he didn't agree with Stillwell? Yes, indeed. Okay, that is correct. Yes.
Several times people have accused Chiang Kai-shek of being corrupt. Was he? Or were they just trying to...
The question is, was Chiang Kai-shek corrupt? Was Chiang Kai-shek personally corrupt? I would say no. Was Chiang Kai-shek's government corrupt? I would say yes. And it's certainly anything but democratic. It's an authoritarian government. We'll get there, though. So, all right. So he writes an article. Brooks Atkinson writes this article, and it's called Yan'an, a Chinese Wonderland City. Okay. I mean, and now we're going to quote a little bit from old Brooks here. He writes this.
Smoking that stuff. Was there any question of him smoking the stuff that was available?
I have no idea if he was on drugs, just so you know. The decision is, Atkinson writes in this article, the decision to relieve General Stillwell represents the political triumph of a moribund anti-democratic regime that is more concerned with maintaining its political supremacy than in driving the Japanese out of China. The Chinese communists have good armies that are now fighting guerrilla warfare against the Japanese in North China. The Generalissimo regards these armies as the chief threat to his supremacy, has made no sincere attempt to arrange at least a truce with them for the duration of the war. No diplomatic genius, referring to Stillwell, could have overcome the Generalissimo's basic unwillingness to risk his armies in battle with the Japanese. So once again, the press is accusing the nationalists of not fighting, of not cooperating with Mao. There's certainly a lot of debate that could be made about the some is true, yes. The majority of this, I would say, is untrue. So this is what the press in the United States is doing to the nationalist Chinese as well. Well, Hurley then, again, oddball, goes and meets with Mao. And Mao basically tells him the same story. And Hurley, he's such a vacillating character, I guess the best way to put it, is kind of whoever he's talking to at that time, he kind of buys off on what they're saying. So at this time, he decides that he's going to support the communists. And so he basically tells, Mao that, well, this is a great idea. What we're going to do is we're going to have a shared government between the nationalists and the Chinese communists, and we're going to have a shared military. And he gives in to a lot of Mao's demands. He doesn't bother to inform Chiang Kai-shek that he's made these agreements. So Chiang Kai-shek, when he finds out, of course, is furious. Again, we see that America is separating itself from the nationalists. So we have to look at Ichi-Go as being a major defeat for the nationalist Chinese, primarily because their army did perform poorly. Now, there's a lot of reasons why I said why that occurred, but indeed, this causes the U.S. to lose faith in Chiang's leadership of China. And that'll, of course, have repercussions post-war. Again, it has lasting effects. The defeat of the national armies encourages the U.S. to support Mao. So why do we support Mao? Well, part of the reason is again, Mao is in the north. And we are planning to have an invasion of China in the northern part of China. So we think it's a great idea to have, and it is, to have support from the Chinese communists in order to help support an invasion that we're planning in that area. Of course, that invasion never really happens until post-war. But that's kind of the thought process. And really, we can see much of the Japanese success can be attributed, not 100%, but some of their success for Ichi-Go can be attributed to the fact that Stillwell drew troops away to take them to Burma. We don't really support the Chinese nationalist army with much Lend-Lease support. And indeed, there's a major problem with the fact that we're trying to use that B-29 in China. So what will actually happen is things are getting so bad that even Stillwell says, what we need to do, we need to stop supporting the B-29 for a little while, and we need to get all the supplies we can in to support me at the Lido Road, and of course to support Chang and Chennault's Air Force to stop this Japanese offensive. And it goes to Hap Arnold, who's the head of the Army Air Force and is also on the Joint Chiefs. And Hap Arnold is so committed to the B-29 program that he says, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to continue to build B-29 bases in China. By the way, the Chinese are the people building these bases. And we're not going to stop sending supplies to create this bomber force. Again, we can see that's not been particularly effective in helping the Chinese defeat the Japanese at Ichi-Go. Well, who's the big winner of Ichi-Go? This is Mao Zedong. Of course, we've seen that the Japanese have taken forces away from him. The nationalists have withdrawn forces away from him, and this gives him a much larger area to control. It takes away a lot of resistance that he had, and it's going to help his narrative that he is going to be the person that defeated Japan. We'll talk about that. The nationalists, of course, they're trying to maintain these Western-style armies, unlike Mao with his guerrilla warfare. They're much, much harder to maintain. They need much, much more supplies, tanks, guns, etc., that a guerrilla army does not need. And so what happens is, because of their lot of policies, which we've talked about, the Chinese people begin to see the nationalists as an enemy of the Chinese people. Well, failure of the nationalists, of course, to stop the Japanese brought to light in the U.S. press. The U.S. press starts to, remember, the United States is a democracy, and the president has to listen to what the people are saying and see it. When the press gets involved with something like this, it begins to be a problem. It becomes such a problem post-war that Truman decides that he's going to not support the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War. Well, and Mao basically states post-war, and I think this is particularly interesting. He's having a meeting with Japanese ambassadors, I guess. This is in the 60s. And he says, quite honestly, they're apologizing. So they're telling Mao, hey, we're really sorry we invaded China, and we feel bad about this. And Mao basically says, as the story goes, that he tells them to stop apologizing. Don't apologize, because without Japanese invasion, my forces would still be in the wilderness. So he would never have been able to become the leader of China without Japan. And that's his feelings about this. So when we really look at these situations, we have to understand that Ichi-Go plays a major part in the disintegration of the nationalist government, and especially in the eyes of the U.S., who would be supporting them. Well, let's try to talk quickly about the end of World War II in Japan. And I've covered this in much greater detail in my class about the atomic bomb and the end of World War II. But just briefly, I want to give you some ideas of what's going on and why Japan is going to end the war as quickly as they do. One of the big reasons is the B-29 bomber, but it's not the B-29 bomber coming from China. It's the B-29 bombers coming from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. So we begin to bomb the 5 largest Japanese cities, I believe, in really when we start firebombing, which is primary incendiary raids. That starts, I believe, in March of 45. The first big one's going to be Tokyo. And we attack these 5 largest cities, and then we begin to attack 59 smaller cities. So what do we achieve with incendiary attacks on Japanese cities is, in the small cities, we destroy 76 square miles. We burn it to the ground. In the 5 largest cities, we burn to the ground 99 square miles, or a total of 175 square miles of Japanese cities are burned to the ground, causing massive casualties of the Japanese civilian population. This is without using atomic bombs. Well, B-29 force is growing. We spent $3 billion on it. We got a lot of B-29s rolling down the assembly lines, and the estimate is that by November of 1945, we would be able to drop 80,000 tons of conventional weapons onto the Japanese cities. Let's put that in perspective with the atomic bomb. The 2 atomic bombs, the Fat Man is 20 kilotons or 20,000 tons. The little boy is approximately, depends on who you read, 15 kilotons. So 15,000 tons. So that's 35,000 tons of explosives. But we can only make 1 bomb a month at this time. Remember, the atomic bomb is not really a weapon system. It's basically a science project. It's not weaponized, okay? They're hand built, okay? And we can only build 1 a month. So basically what we can do is we can destroy the Japanese cities without the atomic bomb. And indeed, we've done a great job of doing that. You can see in this picture, the red area is sections of Japanese cities, major cities that have been burned to the ground. Well, what are we going to do next with all this capability is we're running out of cities to burn. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin to attack Japanese infrastructure, railroads, bridges, tunnels. And what that's going to do is the Japanese don't have a lot of roads, and they certainly don't have a lot of fuel in order to supply trucks and use them to move food. It's going to destroy the Japanese ability to feed their people. So what's going to happen if we do this is they're going to begin to starve to death. There's other issues with this as well. Of course, we've talked about the blockade and the mining program, because the Japanese don't produce enough food in general to support their population. They have to import. Well, they can't get any imports. And then they've lost 28% of the capability to supply their people anyway, because of stripping farmers to go into military service. They can't get any fertilizer, which they need to grow rice. And so now their food production on the island is down 28%. And of course, our bombing of their cities has destroyed massive supplies of food as well, particularly Tokyo. They lose 25% of their rice reserve in one of the fire bombings. So the Japanese by 1945, particularly later in 1945, after they surrendered, are starving to death. The reason they don't starve to death is the U.S. begins to import food at the urgings of Douglas MacArthur. But otherwise, there was mass starvation in Japan at this time. Well, the Japanese have other problems. Here's the Soviet Union. And this is going to be a huge problem for them. So remember that they had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in 1941. And my opinion of any time you sign a non-aggression pact with a fascist country or the Soviet Union, it's basically just a scrap of paper. So indeed, even though they have a non-aggression pact, they're going to invade this area, Manchuria, Manchukuo. We basically urged them to do this at the Yalta Conference of 1944. The last thing the Western allies want is to have the fight all over Asia, mainland, fighting Japanese, rooting them out one at a time. And indeed, they make a decision that they're going to request that the Soviet Union get into this war. Of course, they're not going to do it for free. And indeed, Stalin pledges that 90 days after they defeat Germany, that indeed they will launch a war against the Japanese, because the expectation is this war could drag on into 1947. So that's going to be the next piece. Well, they're going to do that. And when are they going to do that? On August 9th. They bring in the Japanese ambassador, and the Japanese ambassador is told, you know, hey, tough luck, we're at war. And then at 1 a.m. approximately, they begin to invade Manchuria. As you can see, it's a three-pronged assault. Soviet Union has control of a large area border with Manchuria. It has a control of a large area in Mongolia. That's to the left in this picture. And indeed, they are actually have a border with North Korea. So they're in a great position to have this three-pronged attack. And they launch this thing on the puppet state of Manchukuo. Now, what else happens on August 9th? We dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Japanese are having a really bad day. That's the best way I could put it. All right, so this offensive is going to be quite successful, because what happens is the Japanese have stripped the Kwantung Army, as we've talked about. So the Kwantung Army is not nearly as powerful as it used to be. The forces that the Russians are bringing in have excellent tanks. They have tons of trucks that we've given them. They're much, much more mechanized than the Japanese forces, of course. And indeed, the Japanese forces cannot contend with this. It's just basically becoming a disaster. They're going to fight to the death, though, like they always do. But this offensive by the Russians is completely successful. And even though they take significant casualties, they are basically going to capture all of Manchuria, and they're going to capture Korea all the way to the 38th parallel. I put a little red line in there. That's not exactly accurate, so I don't think that is. But that's to give you an idea of how much territory they're going to capture, and very quickly. Well, they're also going to do some other things. Well, we have promised them some stuff, and they had lost half of Sakhalin Island. That is the red circle here. In the Treaty of Portsmouth of 1905, and we've agreed that they can have it back if they join the war. And so we're going to give them that. And they're going to get the Kurile Islands, and that's the black circle. And so all these things have been encouraging the Russians to get into this fight with us. And of course, they're going to have some concessions in Manchuria as well. So again, nothing's really free. Well, the Russians decide what they're going to do, though, is they're going to invade Hokkaido, which is the northernmost main island of Japan. That is the yellow circle there, or might be orange, whatever color. Anyway, that is going to be a three-division landing. They don't have the lift to deliver 3 divisions at one time, but that's the overall goal. But note the date. It's 8/22/1945. Interestingly, the Japanese have surrendered to us on 8/15/45. Well, that's a problem. And quite honestly, Truman says, you know, I don't think you should do this, you know, and quite honestly, my Navy's a lot bigger than your Navy. And so basically, Truman prevents the Japanese from taking the island of Hokkaido.
The Russians.
The Russians, excuse me. Sorry. The Russians were taking the island. Thank you. So the Russians are going to capture 2,726,000 Japanese nationals. 1/3 of those approximately are military in this entire operation. They're going to basically turn these people into slave laborers. The first winter alone, 179,000 civilians are going to die in Russian captivity. 66,000 soldiers are going to die. They only ever return 2,379,000 of these people as they are marched off basically to help build Russian infrastructure in primarily Siberia. And so literally they take millions of Chinese people and turn them into slave laborers, or Japanese people, excuse me, and turn them into slave laborers. And so they don't release the majority of these people until 1948. And then some of them are finally returned, the last of them are finally returned in 1956. So it's incredibly bad behavior by the Japanese, or excuse me, by the Russians against the Japanese. Well, we have to think about this too. Had they invaded Hokkaido, the Russians, indeed, would that be another North Korea type situation today? Again, that's beyond the scope of this class, but it's certainly something to think about. That Truman perhaps prevented a bigger problem that we'd be even facing today with the Soviet Union at the time. Well, what's Japan doing about all this? And simply this, that they are trying to get a negotiated peace. They don't want to accept unconditional surrender. That's the last thing they want to do. So before the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, they're actually reached out to the Soviet Union to mediate a peace between the Japanese and the British, the United States, the Western Allies. And of course, that goes out the window when the Japanese are basically crushed by the Soviets invading into Manchuria. So that's out non-negotiable at that point. And it's really a problem for the emperor, because the emperor is very, very concerned that if the Soviets take over Japan, that will be the end of his 2,600-year family reign. So he is very, very concerned about the Russians getting into Japan and basically overthrowing his capability. Because remember, the Russians are very, very anti-religion. And basically, he's a religious figure in many ways. So that's a big problem for him. The Japanese government has suppressed any information of what's going on in the war from the Japanese people. The Japanese people basically have no idea that they're losing the war until we begin to burn their cities to the ground. This comes as a huge surprise. Okay. I thought we were winning. But so when it comes to the Japanese people, their biggest concern is the U.S. bombing, and that's why they realize that they need to end the war. Not necessarily the Japanese government and the emperor. Certainly that's a factor, a huge factor. But indeed, the Japanese people see the bombing as being the huge factor. Well, how does the Japanese government actually work at this time? And there's a thing called the Big Six. And I'm making this as simple as I possibly can. So there's 6 Japanese, many of them are military officers. And they basically control the Japanese government. And the way that works is they will come to a consensus. They present that consensus to the emperor, and then the emperor basically rubber stamps it. That's how they've been running their government during the war. Well, they can't come to an agreement now. 3 of them want to accept the Potsdam Declaration, which is a demand somewhat modified of unconditional surrender. Slightly less aggressive than just demanding unconditional surrender. Well, the other 3 basically want to fight to the death and are committed to what's known as 100 million die as one. So that's a problem. So you got 3 guys want to end the war, 3 guys don't want to end the war, and they cannot come to an agreement. And what will happen is they will make what is basically an unconstitutional decision is they will appeal to the emperor for the emperor to break the deadlock. Pretty much unprecedented. And indeed, he is going to do that. He's going to break the deadlock by accepting the Potsdam Declaration. And he tells the Japanese people that they must endure the unendurable. And with that, Japan's war is over. Yes, sir.
First time the Japanese people have heard from the emperor?
The question is that the first time that the Japanese people had ever heard the voice of the emperor, which is correct. They had never heard him speak previously. And he speaks a very stilted form of Japanese, which many of them don't really understand most of it. He speaks a court language. Okay, so it's again, I've gone into a lot more detail, but realistically, just for the purposes of this class, I'm going to keep it going here. So, well, the end of the war comes as a huge surprise in China. They're not expecting the war to end at this time at all. They're expecting the war to go on for significantly longer. And when we look at China at this point, internationally, they're as strong as they've ever been. They are a charter member of the UN. They are a voting member of the Security Council. Basically, they have a permanent seat there. They've been told by FDR that indeed that they were going to be one of the 4 policemen of the world. So they are also, for the first time in 100 years, they have an independent country. They are no longer under the unequal treaties. Huge, huge gains for Chinese internationally. Unfortunately, China itself is in ruins. It's had approximately 14 million dead. And indeed, they're on the verge of a civil war. So things are very, very poor in China at this time. Well, what happens too is, remember, the Soviets are in Manchuria, which is part of China. And they're not really, Stalin isn't really sold on Mao particularly. And he thinks, the last thing he needs to do is get involved with a fight with the United States. And he says, well, you know what? I'm going to make an agreement with Chiang Kai-shek. And he does. And he tells Chiang Kai-shek, you know what? 90 days, we'll pull out of Manchuria. It'll go back to Chinese rule. No problem. All you got to give us is let us create a Soviet republic in Mongolia, which the Chinese do have some claims on Mongolia. But indeed, Chiang makes this deal. He goes, yeah, we'll take Manchuria back. That's a better deal, believe me, than Mongolia. And they didn't control Mongolia anyway. So that's kind of why he makes this agreement. But he doesn't really talk to Mao about this. And Mao is hot, okay? Mao is really angry at Stalin. Well, like most agreements made with the Soviet Union, there's always problems. And what he does is, Stalin says, yeah, we're going to pull out. And he had promised not to give any of the Japanese arms to the communists. Well, we pulled out, and then we invited Mao Zedong to bring 300,000 guys in. And you know what? We just forgot to take those weapons. So indeed, now Mao has 300,000 men in Manchuria, and they are armed with previously captured Japanese arms. And of course, they will continue to get arms from the Soviet Union as the Civil War goes on. Well, when we look at Chiang and what has happened with his government, you see that indeed he has lost the support of the Chinese people. Part of the reasons, of course, is when he broke the dams in 1938 for the Yellow River and caused all that giant flooding, kills 500,000 Chinese citizens, displaces 900,000. Ruins farmland, causes massive amounts of starvation. Well, then we have the situation where they have not been able to protect the Chinese people from the Japanese with the failure of Ichi-Go. So all these things put together are starting to make the Chinese people think that indeed they would be better off being part of the communists. So in other words, that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is a better alternative to the nationalists. Because we always have to understand that indeed there has never been a democracy in China. Chinese don't know what a democracy really even is. So the Chinese people are not fighting for democracy, but for stability. So when we always talk about in the United States, we're fighting for democracy and try to create democratic governments. Indeed, the Chinese have no idea what that would be like. We've seen a similar situation in modern Russia as well. Well, so the issues of who lost China? This is one of my favorite pieces here. So who lost China? Okay, well, we never had China. That's the first piece. But so post-war, when China becomes a communist country, because of McCarthyism, this becomes a major issue in the United States, particularly politically. And we could see early on, we talked about Clarence Gauss, the ambassador to China at 44, and he sends to Cordell Hull, who's the Secretary of State, he sends a message as early as 44 that China's fascist-like actions make it an embarrassing ally for the U.S. post-war. So even early on, we're starting, before Ichi-Go, we're starting to see major issues between how the fascist-like, because again, don't ever consider the nationalists as being Democrats either. They're not. Okay, they're an authoritarian government. It's like saying that Poland in 1939 was a democracy. No. Okay, so the U.S. has a desire not to get involved in this fratricidal issue with this Chinese Civil War. We don't want anything to do with this. Okay, we've sent General Marshall. Truman sends General Marshall to try to broker an agreement between Mao and the nationalists, and that fails completely. We have landed a Marine amphibious corps on the Chinese mainland in order to repatriate millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians from China, because we want them back in Japan so we can control that area. We don't want these people wandering around causing trouble. So that's really some of the big things that Marshall is there to do. Well, indeed, what happens is he can't broker an agreement between Mao and the nationalists. And indeed, what happens then is he is going to be recalled. So Truman is getting very, very fed up with this whole situation. And again, they don't want to get too involved, because if we get too involved, there's a thinking that perhaps the Russians will get involved. And we certainly, the last thing we want to do is have a Russian giant army come in and help the Chinese. So this is going to be a major, major problem for them. So we don't want to do that either. Well, what will happen, of course, is that Truman will eventually suspend shipments and aid to China. And so now the Chinese nationalists are not getting any arms or supplies. Of course, the Chinese communists are getting arms and supplies from the Russians. And Truman says, I love this line. He goes, sending more arms is like pouring sand in a rat hole. So in other words, we have washed our hands of the nationalists by this time. Well, we're going to use some pieces from a book by Sir Rana Mitter. It's called Forgotten Ally, and he makes some really great points. And when we look at it today, in the West, we don't think much about Chinese role in World War II. In fact, I think I mentioned that I was talking to my sister about building this class, and I had said that I was going to build a class about China and World War II. And my sister's response was, well, what did China have to do with World War II? So we see that indeed China had a lot to do with World War II. They were basically, starting in 1937, the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong are the only Asian groups that fight against Japan from 1937 to 1945. So they do have a major role here. Again, they had 14 million dead. And Mitter says this, without Chinese resistance, China would have become a Japanese colony as early as 1938. This would have allowed Japan dominance over the mainland and would have allowed Tokyo to turn its attention to expansion in Southeast Asia even more swiftly and with less distraction. A pacified China would also have made the invasion of British India much more plausible. Without the China quagmire, a quagmire caused by the refusal of the Chinese to stop fighting, Japan's imperialist ambitions would have been much easier to fulfill. So indeed, China has a key role in World War II. And we need to recognize that because, of course, the Chinese are going to want us to recognize it today. Trust me. Well, I like this piece here because as we talked about in this class, the big outcome of World War II is going to be similar to what occurred in World War I, only it's going to occur in Asia instead of in Europe. And that's going to be the fact that there's going to be the creation of new countries. We see this with four major imperial powers in World War I going away and the creation of many, many European new countries. Same thing will occur in Asia. So many historians today, and myself included, believe that World War II starts in 1937 at the Marco Polo Bridge incident in China. And when we look at this, it's not really in Poland in September of 39, but indeed in China where the war is going to start. And the most important effect is going to be the end of not just Western imperialism, but Japanese imperialism as well. And because this is going to change the dominance of this area, we saw that the Dutch controlled Indonesia since 1603. So what they're going to do is the Japanese have set the stage in many ways by creating Pan-Asianism, by helping Asian nationalism to see how the world will change today. So what happens, I think, is what you're going to have is a power vacuum post-World War II. And you've got this power vacuum. And as always with power vacuums, somebody's going to fill that vacuum. And indeed, what's going to happen is these new countries are going to fill that power vacuum. So Europe is fought out after 2 world wars in a matter of a few years, and they can no longer really control this area any longer. And of course, we are going to help that. Certainly, I believe personally that the United States is a key player in stopping Western imperialism and Japanese imperialism. I think that we certainly helped in many regards, not all, but in many regards, we helped Asian countries become independent. Well, we look at the defeat of Japan, what's going to occur? Of course, we're going to see the Dutch will lose Indonesia in 1949. The British will give up India in 47. They will give up Burma in 48. We will see that we've given independence to the Philippines in 46. And of course, the Vietnamese will fight until 54 against the French. We can also see that basically Korea, that war has never really ended. That's really just a truce going on there. So when we look at this map, we could see the change. You could see that all these are independent countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, India. All these countries now are basically no longer parts of colonialism. And that is the single biggest piece that I think comes out of World War II. Well, I had promised, and I'm going to make this brief, that I would talk about World War II in China today. And I got a few minutes, and I'm going to try to get this out as quickly as possible. We have to understand that when Mao takes over in 49, he is going to completely suppress any thing that the nationalists did that was any good at all. Basically, the nationalists were stooges of the Japanese. They didn't fight. It was entirely Mao and the communists that drive the Japanese out of China. That's the narrative. The other key pieces, of course, is they're going to be a communist government, and they're going to export world communism. Well, problem occurs after Mao's death that indeed their economy is going to change. It's no longer going to be totally a communist economy. It's going to be basically a capitalist economy. They don't admit that. Of course, they refer to it as a market economy. But indeed, that's going to be a change. So their narrative was indeed that they were going to export world communism. Well, all of a sudden, that's kind of hard to say when you're kind of being capitalist. So what are they going to do is they need a new vehicle to create the kind of nationalism that, you know, we enjoy. And so basically they're going to try to use the anti-Japanese campaign to do that. So, for example, I think very interesting, there is not, for example, a museum that talks about the rape of Nanking in 1938. And that museum isn't built until 1985. So basically all knowledge of the nationalist part in World War II is taken away from the Chinese people, but now they need a new narrative. China has been viewed as a victim. Okay, they're viewed as a victim from 1842 with the Opium Wars. They're viewed as a victim in World War II. That's not helping the Chinese narrative today. They want to be viewed as basically a nation both strong, victorious, and morally righteous. So in other words, they want to have the same things that we feel about destroying the fascist governments of the Japanese, the Germans, etc. They want to be recognized as a part of that as well. But they've suppressed this, so now they have to basically resurrect Chiang Kai-shek. Well, if you resurrect Chiang Kai-shek, you get another advantage, because quite honestly, if you resurrect him, now you can say that the communist China had a role at the Cairo conference. And we talked about the Cairo conference, and it can be seen as being on the side of the Allies. So what was promised at the Cairo conference to the nationalist government should now go to the Chinese Communist government today. And Mitter says this, I love this line. He goes, Chang wrote a check that communist China now wants to cash. And I just think that's a great line about how they now want to take Taiwan back. They want the 9 dash line with the Spratly Islands. They want islands that Japan currently controls. They want all this stuff back that they feel was promised to them, was promised to the nationalists by the West, that they deserve that today. And then finally, the Chinese see their role in World War II is not a fight for individual rights, but for international order and guardian of an authoritarian domestic social contract that stresses collective economic well-being over individual rights. So indeed, an authoritarian government is a better form of government than a democratic one. It offers security to the people at the expense of individual rights, which of course they feel are unimportant. So you can see there's a huge difference between how we view democracy and, of course, the Chinese never really see democracy. And then finally, I'd like to say that China sees itself as a creator of world order post-war and the U.S. as a threat to that order. They wish to change the narrative of the U.S. liberating Asia from imperialism. So basically, we see World War II as that we liberated Asia from Japanese imperialism, that we beat those fascist governments. The Chinese want that narrative at least to be that they had an equal role in that. And with that, I want to thank all of you for coming for all these classes. Those of you on Zoom, thank you for attending as well. And hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon.